an MBA and you're considering a dual program or something like that where the GRE is accepted, then what you're going to have to consider is can the GMAT transfer over there, or maybe MLT would not be a program for you because if you are participating in MLT, you will have to take the GMAT. Okay. So back to the CAT. So the GMAT CAT, right, which stands for Computer Adaptive Test. Okay. The GMAT is a computer adaptive test, which is one of the things that makes it interesting and fun, right? It's one of the things that make it challenging. Because what a computer adaptive test does and what the GMAT itself does is it's not simply a test of knowledge, which is what most of our tests in school have been, right? They test you on information. They test you on your acquisition of knowledge. The GMAT CAT doesn't do that. It's testing a variety of things, sort of all at the same time. Knowledge, recognition, and execution, I think, are the three biggest things that tend to impact the GMAT performance, right? Or three of the four big things that tend to impact the GMAT performance. And so to prepare for the test, what you should be thinking about is not just increasing your knowledge base, not just learning formulas and rules and terms, right? But you're also thinking about, have I learned to recognize what's being tested in sort of atypical ways, which is what the GMAT tends to do. It tests things you've learned in ways you probably haven't seen it before. So we're going to run through kind of how each of these things will impact your score, right? And then we'll tie it all together with the final thing, which is going to be confidence, right? You need to be able to go into the test and absolutely definitively say to yourself, I know I'm going to get this number. I know that on my worst possible day, if somebody walked in and stabbed the dude behind me and slapped me upside my head 3 times, I would still walk out the room with a 650, right? You should be that confident going into the test. That way, no matter what happens, you walk out with a score that's acceptable, right? With a score that you can live with, right? So what do I mean by knowledge, right? What I mean by that is, whoa, 1 second. Sorry, somebody maximize the chat window. All right, great. So what I mean by that is memorizing, but also understanding, right? So you got to memorize rules, formulas, terms, right? You have to understand what those things are and how that impacts your score. So let's start with a quick question. What's a prime number? Type it in the chat window if you know, right? Anyone know what a prime number is? I'm sure some of you have been preparing for the GMAT, and you should know, that should be one of the basic bits of information that you've acquired in the course of preparing for the GMAT. All right, we've got a few answers coming in. We've got a couple of people who are steering themselves wrong. I've seen somebody conflate a couple of things, which tends to be what happens a lot with the test. So when we're looking at the test, right, you're thinking about these different things that they're going to throw out. A prime number is not an odd number, right? Some prime numbers are odd. Many prime numbers are odd, but not all of them, right? A prime number is a number that has exactly 2 factors, one in itself. So that's a common thing that happens on the test, is partially acquiring knowledge, right? Knowing some of the information, but the GMAT will intentionally, specifically test you on all the things people tend to forget, right? Facts and information and knowledge, like what's the difference between a number of and amount of, right? Do you understand those distinctions on the verbal end, right? Do you know what 13 exclamation point means, right? So as you're thinking about acquisition of knowledge, you're thinking about, okay, do I know all these terms? As he's flashing those things up there, do I have an immediate response that says, I know what this means, right? Because you have to start by knowing the terms, the definitions, because if you don't, then your ability to apply those terms and definitions is challenged, right? Let's think about this in a slightly different way. So if we have this question, what is x cubed plus x cubed, right? How many of us know exactly what to do with that? Think about your answer. Even jot it down in front of you to see if you understand what that means, right? And if you do know what that means, that's great, right? Let's keep playing with it. Add the exponents is actually incorrect, right? Because x cubed plus x cubed is 2x cubed. So as you're preparing for this test, right, if you've prepared for this test, a factoid like this should be something that's quick, easy, immediately that you understand. Because what the GMAT does, what a CAT test does, is it starts to make it more difficult. It starts to accelerate it, right? It starts to adapt. So let's give you the harder form of that. What's 3 to the fourth plus 3 to the fourth, right? Think through that answer. You don't have to type it if you don't want to, or you can type it if that makes you happy, right? Everybody got their answer in their head? Let's see if you did it. So that's 2 times 3 to the fourth. So again, what you're doing in preparing for the test is not just learning rules, right? It starts by learning rules, right? It starts by learning what do you do when you add exponent, and can you hang as I make them more difficult? So what would you do with x to the fourth plus x to the fifth, right? That's part of what this test does. And notice what's happening here, right? I'm taking one simple rule and just asking it to you in different ways to see if you can still track it and still apply the rules correctly as I sort of change the presentation of it. Good job, Ronald. Ronald actually saw it right away that since you actually can't do, well, you can't add them the way in which we added the other two because the exponents aren't the same, but you can factor it. So this is a reasoning test, right? They claim that the GMAT is a test of higher order thinking, which fundamentally means it's not a test of calculation, right? It's a test of reasoning. It's a test of problem solving using math and verbal rules, but it's not a test of math and verbal. Someone suggested leaving x to the fourth plus x to the fifth alone, which is sort of true, but not completely true, because the GMAT's never going to give you a question in which you don't do anything at all. Right? So there's always something you can do with it. And half the challenge here is taking the information you're giving and understanding how to manipulate it, how to turn it around, how to think about it in a different way. So the first thing you need to think about is you got to learn your rules 2 tequilas deep. After your second tequila in the club, no matter what happens, you still need to know the rule for adding exponents. Because if you don't know it that well, when they start to ask you to apply that rule in a funky way under the timed pressure of dealing with the test, then things are going to get messy. So you got to start off by knowing these rules. I should be able to call you up on a Saturday night at 1 a.m. when you're, 2 sheets to the wind, having drunk you whatever your favorite drink of the day is, and you should still be able to tell me what the smallest prime number is. Let's see if we can apply that to a GMAT question. So, take a look at this question, think about it for a minute, and then choose your answer. So we got a couple, I'm going to give you a couple more minutes. We have a few people voting. All right. Here we go. We put up a poll so that we can just see the statistics as the question plays around. Okay, looks like choices A and D are competing for the favorite answer. All right, we'll take a little bit longer and then I'll broadcast the results in just another minute. So if anybody else wants to throw in their final answer, don't be shy. You won't be put on blast if you didn't get it. All right. Last 10 seconds to vote on the poll. Great. Let's broadcast those results. Let's see. And most people seem to have chosen A, which is actually the incorrect answer. I'm so sorry about that. So if we think back through what we were just talking about, right? We were saying that when you add numbers with exponents, right? What happens is that you keep the base. If the base and the power are the same, you have to add the coefficient fundamentally. Well, here what that means is we have 3 times 3 to the 14, which then we apply the rule for multiplication, which makes this answer 3 times 3 to the 15, and the correct answer becomes D. So think about that, right? We just went through 3 previous examples using this exact same rule, and then I drop it in a GMAT question, and things start to go awry. about half the people who answered the question, actually less than half, got it right? So what you're trying to think about, and as you're preparing for the test, you're not just learning a rule. You're not just saying, here's what I do when I add exponents. You're trying to make sure that you've exposed yourself to all the different ways that they're going to present these exponent rules to you so that you have a solid understanding of what the rules are and a solid understanding of the various ways they could present it to you. So it's not just about acquiring knowledge, it's about proper application of the knowledge, right? It's about making sure you're able to use it in a variety of thoughtful ways. Right? Let's keep going. Let's see if we can redeem ourselves this time. So here is one more question dealing with exponent. Think about it for a second and then we'll post a poll. All right. So go ahead and choose your favorite answer. All right, we've got a whole bunch of people voting. Seems like we've got a whole lot of learning happening. And so far, based on the results, it seems like my job is mostly done. So as you start to look at this test, right, like think about what this would have meant had I started you with this question. Would you have picked the same answer if I started you with this 4 slides ago before we scaled it up from those 3 kind of with no answer choices to the one we just did to this one, right? Now that you've seen it in a variety of ways, it becomes easier to understand what they're testing, how to approach it, what the logic behind the question is, right? And that's fundamentally what the GMAT is about, right? It's about being able to take that learning and apply it in a variety of ways. So I'm going to just go ahead and end that poll, and looks like most people got this one right. Great. Right? So understanding this test, right? Understanding and preparing for the GMAT is about acquiring the knowledge and the information you need to do well on the test, but also learning how to apply it and learning how to apply it in the format of the test, right? Learning that what they're going to do is not change the rules, but change how it's presented and change how you have to look at it, all right? So again, that's what they're getting at with sort of this higher order thinking, right? They want to see if you're able to apply this thinking in a broad range of presentations and different applications. So we could take this one more time and apply it to data sufficiency. Right? Data sufficiencies are one of the question types that most people have a little bit more trouble with because it's a bit more convoluted, a bit more thinking involved, right? So if we look at this question, right, and take a minute to look at it, and then we'll post the poll in a second to see how people do. But again, with data sufficiency, you got to learn how to manage the choices, right? Learn how to navigate, um, learn how to navigate the answer choices because they're a mess to read. So you have to have a strategy for dealing with the answer choices. You have to have a strategy for managing the information that will be tested and how that information will be tested. All right, so let's go ahead and publish this poll, and then we'll see how you guys do. All right, so go ahead and choose your favorite answer. Okay, we have a few people voting here. All right, let's let a couple more people take a stab at it. And even if you're not 100% sure, just go ahead and take a stab at it. It'll be fine. All right, so when you're thinking through, right, managing the test, what you want to start to do is create plans, right? Have an approach for every single question type. You don't want to go into the GMAT being surprised by anything. So you'll need to do sufficient questions, right? You want to have done a ton of practice. You want to have done multiple practice tests. I don't think anyone should go into the real GMAT without having done at least 3, if not 4 or 5 practice tests, right? Because then you're just selling yourself short, right? You should make sure you've done GMAT prep, which is the test from, the official test makers, right? So no matter how good Bell Curve's test might be or somebody else's test might be, we can't compete with GMAT Prep because that's the test from the people who wrote it. So they're always going to be the best. So we need to make sure that, you need to make sure that you're taking the best possible practice test you can. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and publish those results. And most people here selected C. Again, run into a little bit of trouble. There's a little bit of funkiness in this question because what it's actually doing is forcing you to combine two different things, right? It's forcing you to combine the concept of primeness along with the exponent rules, which now makes it a little bit more difficult, a little bit more challenging, right? There's a couple of different things that are really in play here. With data sufficiency, it's a lot like being a lawyer, like Bill Clinton on the stand, right? Remember when Bill Clinton said it depends on what the word is means? That's what data sufficiency almost always is doing, right? Data sufficiency is almost always asking if you understand what that actually means, if you understand what they're telling you. Well, here, the real question fundamentally amounts to, are X and Y positive? The reason for that is, if you thought about what 25y means, 25y really means 5 to the 2y power. So then in order to find out if this is a prime number, the only way the sum of multiples of 5 will be a prime number is if that number was actually 5. So this cannot be a prime unless 5 to the x plus 25 to the y actually was equal to 5. And the only way for it to be equal to 5 is if the powers were 0. Or if the powers were 1 or 0 or something funky. So if we found out that x and y are greater than 0, then we're actually going to know that there is no way for this to be a prime number. Hopefully that makes some sense. So therefore, statement 2 on its own is immediately sufficient because it immediately tells us that they're positive integers. Therefore, there is no way for this to be a prime number because the only prime we could have gotten out of this was the number 5. Hopefully that makes some sense. So what you're thinking about here, right, is what is the test testing, right? It's testing complex thinking. It's testing multiple concepts. It's testing your ability to apply rules in a variety of ways. So it's not just learning how do you add exponents. It's learning how do you add exponents and then how do you apply that in sort of a complex way in a variety of settings, okay? And so the better you get at this, the more you do it, the easier it becomes. Most of you really nailed those last couple of problem-solving questions, and then when we put it into data sufficiency, it got a little bit trickier. We also made this problem a little bit harder, so don't be dismayed if this one was a challenge. So the right answer for that was B, just to be clear. All right, great. So if we took this at the all the way through sort of to verbal as well, right? If we looked at the verbal portion, right, what they're testing in verbal, especially sentence correction, are specific, very narrow grammar rules, right? There's 6 common rules they test, and if you learn those well, then dealing with the test becomes a lot easier. But there's sort of like 13, if you really wanted to take it out to everything they've sort of ever tested, then 13 or so rules are really all they do. And that's good news because there are tons of grammar rules in English. And if you had to study them all, like you'd just spend all year studying for the GMAT. Instead, they narrow the list. They only test a few sort of crucial things. And the more you're ready for those few crucial things, again, the easier it becomes. So you should just make sure you go into the test knowing, here's what they commonly test, here's how it commonly shows up, this is how I'm going to deal with it. All right, great. So let's see how well you understand those rules. All right. Anything wrong with that first image? Anybody see anything wrong with it? Think through it. See if you see anything wrong with it. All right. So here's one of the issues with grammar, is that advertising, and anybody who works in advertising, I'm just going to apologize to you now, but advertisers suck at grammar, right? They just butcher the English language in order to sound cool. And the problem with that is that inundates us, that gets us used to seeing, reading bad grammar and trying to make it make sense. The problem here isn't actually a tense change. The problem here is that Starbucks apparently cooks baristas, right? One of the things that GMAT loves to test is modifiers. Well, according to the modifier here, which includes our great baristas, Starbucks coffee includes baristas. So they're apparently putting people in coffee, which must be the reason that we're willing to pay $5 for it, because apparently the flavor of people is delicious. Right? So the bad grammar here, right, has created a sort of sense of that sort of makes you think that these things are good, right? Gets you used to this type of bad grammar, right? Another ad I took in the New York City subway, right? There's a problem with this ad. Anybody see what's wrong with it? Yep, what's wrong with fewer? Or I see what you're saying, John. John's suggesting that instead of less, we use the word fewer. Yeah, think about how many um, shopping lines, the express lane always has this mistake, right? So we've become used to seeing that mistake and you start to think it's correct, but it's actually not. Right? You use fewer for things that are countable and you use less for things that are not countable. So understanding the rules that they're going to test, understanding the rules of the language become really important to doing well in the test and knowing specifically which ones they're going to test. Okay? So learn the rules they tend to test. Absolutely, Tiffany. Less mustard, fewer hot dogs. Nice. Well put. Um, so we're going to learn the rules they're going to test, right? You're going to walk into the GMAT saying, I know they love to test these things, right? And realize that if they're testing these things, I can look for them. I can be aware of them, right? I can watch out for them when they try to hide them within questions, right? Because the GMAT will, in testing your higher order thinking, half of what they're doing is testing your ability to recognize the rules being tested. So recognition is a key component of this test. So you've got to learn, you got to also work on improving your recognition. Think about all the times you've done GMAT problems and after you saw the explanation, you went, oh, now I understand it, right? That's really an issue of recognition, right? The issue of recognition is really about knowing what's being tested when they're not telling you directly, okay? So you have to learn to spot the common rules being tested. You have to learn to spot them being tested in uncommon ways, all right? And those are sort of the key things to the test, right? And learn to take those strange things and put them back into sort of normal ways. Um, let's see. Adrian wanted me to go back. Let's see if I can find it. I might be able to find it. I was hoping I could. I don't think I'm going to be able to. Wait, here we go. We're close. So the major grammar rules, Adrian, um, is modifiers, pronouns, lists, comparisons, verbs, and idioms, right? And so always look for those. And also remember, all of you will have access to the recording when we're done. So don't worry about all of this going away, all right? You'll still have access to it later on. So let's see if we can understand how to apply this when we start thinking about recognition. Without even trying to do this question, um, I'm not even going to worry about what the correct answer is. What I want you to be able to do is tell me if you see what's being tested here, right? Because if you see what's being tested, then dealing with it becomes that much easier. So why don't we quickly drop it in the chat box if you can see what's being tested in this sentence. How do you know about Tupac's life, Ashley? Wow. There's no way well, okay, Tupac is better than Biggie. I'm with you. I'm with you on that. That's a +1. Well said, Mike. So we have some people noticing verb tense, other people thinking modifiers. I think Ashley's pointing to modifiers. So as you look at these sentences, right, what you should be aware of, what you should be paying attention to, right, is do I see immediately what the common rules are that they're testing, and do I understand how they apply, right? For me, while there is a verb issue going on here, the immediate thing that I notice looking at this is the modifier, which a bunch of people have pointed to as well, right? The first thing, spanning more than 20 years, is a descriptive phrase. Well, every time you have a descriptive phrase, it has to describe whatever comes immediately. It has to be placed as close as possible to what it's describing. So as it's presented, this sentence suggests that Tupac himself spanned 20 years. We all know Biggie was the bigger of the two, so maybe Biggie spanned 20 years, but Tupac was a slim dude, so he clearly did not span 20 years. His career might have spanned 20 years, certainly not the individual. So as you're looking at these things, what you want to make sure you understand is what's a modifier? How is it applied? How are they going to try to hide it from me? There's a common mistake or common game that the GMAT likes to play is they make you think it's Tupac by saying Tupac Shakur's. So they hide the possessive in there so that it appears to be the person they're talking about when it's not actually the person. So in preparing for the test, don't just learn the rules, right? Make sure you understand how the rules will be applied. Make sure you understand when these, where they're going to hide these rules, the way that they typically not only test them, but the ways that they typically hide them from you or present them in bizarre ways. All right, so let's keep rolling. So here the correct answer was C. Let's try one more time. And this time I actually want you to answer it. See if you can come up with the correct answer. We're going to post the poll in just a second, so take a second to read it. All right, so we'll put up the poll. There's that, and then there was, so rule for modifiers, right? And then, of course, the correct answer. All right, so, and this is actually a true statement, mostly. Matthew Knowles was at an MLT conference that I was at a couple of years ago. All right, great. So everybody take a shot at it, see what answer you like the best. Let's just hide the results for a second. All right, so vote on the poll. Put what you think is the correct answer on the poll, and we'll see what wins. Okay, we got the votes coming in. Leading contenders so far are A, B, E, although D is starting to make a late push. All right. Don't feel bad. Take a stab at it. No one's going to call you out if you get it wrong. I see a lot of people being shy and sitting on the sidelines. One of the things that you want to start to develop is an understanding for how to deal with these questions efficiently. When you get good at this test, sentence correction should take you probably about 45 seconds or a minute, because there shouldn't be a whole lot of reading involved. You should be able to look at it fairly efficiently, read through the initial sentence. You should know right away that choice A is exactly the same as the underlined portion, so there's never really a reason to read choice A again, right? So you should know some of the strategies for making yourself more efficient at this test, right? All right, so let's see what people are saying here. Choice A is always exactly the same as the underlined part. So yes, Ashley, what picking choice A means is that you're saying there's no mistake, okay? All right, and one of the key things in preparing for the test is that you've taken it enough times, you've taken enough practice tests so that you walk into the real test with no questions about logistics, right? You know how the choices are structured. Everything from how the choices are structured to what the instructions are to what type of tools you have for writing the essays. Writing the essay, you should know whether you get spell check for that, whether you have cut and paste options, right? All of those things you want to be aware of walking into the test. Jamie, A is correct 1/5 of the time. Okay? So if that answer is helpful at all. All right, so what we want to see here is that this question with Maggie is also a modifier question, right? The issue is a question of what is the into blog post describing, right? So upon reading it, right, answer choice A, the original sentence, leaves it unclear as to what happened in the blog post, right? What it actually reads is the account of Matthew Knowles' donation to MLT into blog post. So it seems almost as if he made the donation into blog post. Answer choice E is the one that clarifies that modifier best, telling you that the writing happened into blog post, right? Not the donation itself. So what you're looking for and what sentence correction are ultimately testing is your ability to clearly and accurately convey what you're saying. The phrase you least want to ever hear or have to say as far as grammar is concerned is "I know what you mean." You never know what someone means. You simply know what they've said to you, right? So what you want to start to do is develop the habit of paying attention to exactly what's said and not thinking about what you think someone actually intended. You want to know what they actually said. Um, so correct answer there being E because it's the only one that modifies properly. Okay. All right, so then let's keep going. So we talked about knowledge. We talked about recognition, right? Those two sentence completions where both of them were modifiers, but one was a bit more obvious than the other, right? And then execution, right? Avoiding those careless mistakes, right? Avoiding those, structural errors of, oh, I misread this, I didn't add properly. Like, how do you manage all of that under timed pressure? How do you get the Urkel out of you, right? So that you're not constantly saying, oops, did I do that? Right? Those are the problems that people who are not great test takers tend to run into. So you have to develop ways to fix those problems, right? How do you avoid those careless mistakes? How do you manage time pressure? Are you the type of person who is constantly thinking about the last question after you've moved on to the next one, right? Because the GMAT's the type of test where you can't go back. So if you are, the type of person who can't let go of a question, it's going to be hard to take this test, right? Um, how do you deal with the pacing and the clock issue? Okay, learning to manage that, learning to understand that, learn to deal with the distractions, right? Um, I've taken the test multiple times, and the last time I took the test, I actually went in with two of my employees, and I wanted to smack one of them because he was a huffer and puffer, right? Jason, he sat like to the computer next to me because three of us went in at the exact same time, and Jason just kept through the whole test. And I just wanted to turn around and pop him upside his head, right? And my GMAT didn't matter to me, and I felt bad for all the other people in the room who had to deal with the huffer and puffer. So you have to be ready to manage all the distractions in the room. Another time I took the test, there was the angry typer behind me. So when you take your practice test, make sure that when you can, take them at work or take them at the library. You want to do it somewhere quiet but not silent, right? Because then you don't train yourself for the way the test is normally and accurately delivered, right? You don't take the test in a silent room. You take the test in a quiet room. Someone might come in and start their test in the middle of your test, right? You also have to learn how to deal with the situation. When you walk into the testing center, they're going to basically pat you down, take a mugshot, and your fingerprints, right? And you've got to be ready for that to go into the test and not be, thrown off or distracted by those types of things. So dealing with the pacing, dealing with the clock, right? Dealing with the time pressure, dealing with not knowing whether you got an answer right or wrong, right? Until like you almost basically never know. So if you are practicing out of the official guide, don't check your answers every single question because that's not how the test itself works, right? So you want to make sure that you're preparing yourself for the format of the test. So if I'm working out of a paper book, I'm going to do 20 or 30 questions before I check my answers, just so that I learn to deal with the time, with the kind of, that sort of mental pressure of did I get the last one right? Right? You got to learn to deal with that and move on to the next question without getting caught up in all of that. All right. So we're going to deal with the time pressure, right? We're going to learn to manage all of that. 10 seconds. Everybody think about your answer. What do you see here? What can we do? All right. Do you see what's being tested? Well, I'm going to give you 10 more seconds, then I'm shutting it down. And we've got people all over the place. All right, so and and there are probably multiple things here that are correct, depending on your perspective, right? Part of what you want to be aware of is, do I see these things right away? Do I understand how the test is structured? Yeah, the first thing that jumps out at me is modifiers. There's lots of things here that indicate modifiers being tested. One is the presence of which. Another is the presence of having been, because that's still a descriptive phrase, although it's a different type of descriptive phrase. It's still a descriptive phrase. But the people who said comparisons are also right. There is a comparison here, right? If you saw colder and wetter than, that does convey a comparison. So what you want to understand is, again, the test will not test one thing only in every question. In every question, they test possibly multiple things, right? And you need to understand what's being tested, how they're testing it, how a rule is applying, recognizing the rule that they're testing. Okay. Um, let's keep rolling. So again, here we've got some kind of more of the same, right? It's a matter of, do you see what's being tested here? And I'm not going to put up a poll for this one. Just sort of looking at these things and saying, hey, do we understand what's going on here, right? Can you immediately identify what's being tested, right? We see obviously that there's Jamie, the answer to the last one was B. Um, we should see on this question that there's prime numbers being tested. We should also see that there's a question of factorial being tested, right? And what you want to make sure you understand is, do you know what a factorial is, right? Do you understand a factorial? Do you understand how to apply that? Do you have strategies for managing things when you don't know how to answer this? Those of you who are gravitating towards C on this, um, that's immediately kind of incorrect. That's an RTFQ as far as I'm concerned, right? Because what did the question ask for? Things that were not prime. So picking a prime number is immediately incorrect, right? And this is what I mean by execution. Thank you, whoever it was who gave me the perfect example, right? Under time pressure, are you going to make those careless mistakes that immediately decrease your score? So what you need to do is learn to manage, learn to understand, learn to deal with the time pressure and the pressure of answering these questions relatively quickly. Right? I'm not going to run through how to actually do this, but we do want to understand is that anyone who is thinking A or C, right, is needs to work on their execution. And what I mean by that is things as simple as, even when I don't know what the right answer is, I should be able to determine, I should not pick bad wrong answers, right? You don't have to pick the right one all the time, but you want to make sure that you're not picking bad wrong answers by not reading the question carefully and things of that nature. Exactly, right? So avoiding careless mistakes, avoiding sort of those silly kind of preventable errors are really going to be important to making sure you maintain a good score, right? And if we sort of apply that to verbal, right? Verbal overall is a test of specificity, right? It's a test of careful reading. It's a test of understanding what you read, right? Which is very different than the reading many of us tend to do sort of in a daily basis, right? So take a quick second and read this blurb, and then we'll turn it into a question. And we'll put up a poll to see how you do. All right. So let's see how well you can manage this. All right, so go ahead and cast your votes on the poll, and we'll see what happens. So as you're preparing for the test, right, your major focus in terms of preparation is going to be acquiring the knowledge that you need for the test, right? And for the reading comprehension portion of the test, there's no specific knowledge you need, right? But for all of the math, obviously, for the sentence corrections, definitely, right? But for the reading comp and the critical reasoning, it's less about knowledge and more about sort of a skill set, right? And So acquiring the knowledge, acquiring the skill set necessary for the test. In addition to that, learning how to recognize what's being tested. All right. On top of that is also executing properly. Right. Part of that is knowing kind of what types of answers are going to be right and incorrect, what sort of habits you have that lead you to wrong answers. We have a whole lot of people here who are voting for choice B, so I'm going to shut the poll down and let you guys see those results. And the incorrect answer is B, which is totally understandable, right? Although incorrect. When you think about the specifics of the words that are used, the correct answer is C. Now I know many of you hate that answer, right? Because that answer is you're gonna get in trouble if you say that answer to the wrong person, right? But based on the definitions of those words, it is correct. Nothing in choice C is actually inaccurate, whereas choice B extends this well beyond what you were told, right? No one talked about the children's abilities in the passage at all, so there's no way that choice B is correct, right? Choice D, nothing was said about that. So reading comprehension is really about your ability to read what they're telling you, use the information given to you, but to go no further than what they've given you. And often that's hard to do because our sort of cultural influences talk about that, right? Our cultural influences sort of encourage us to pick certain answers, um, whereas that's not really what the test is about, right? So we have to learn to avoid those types of mistakes, our predispositions to things, and use the words exactly as the test intended them, okay? Or as the dictionary uses them is sort of a better way to put that. But it's not a reach, right? Because it's the only one that's supported. You were told that they live together. You were told that he supervises the children. And therefore, that answer is actually accurate based on dictionary definitions. And that's kind of what you have to deal with, right? That's what you have to understand. The more you understand that it's not about like whether you agree with that, whether you'd allow your boyfriend to say that or your husband to say that. I know many people, if your husband or wife said that to you, you'd have to stab them, which is totally acceptable. Um, but in the context of the test, it's simply going by dictionary definitions. Right? All right, so what you have to deal with, right, what we're kind of learning to deal with is how the test is structured, the kinds of things they ask us to do. Um, exactly. So if you live with someone, right? So okay, back to the question since y'all are debating it. I like that, right? If you live with someone, see y'all are silly now. Let's not go down the baby daddy route. See, the GMAT doesn't go into baby daddy, right? So, but if you live with someone, that person is technically a roommate. So what you're trying to do, what you're trying to learn, is you're trying to learn to separate your personal opinions, right, from the accuracy of the language. And yes, Shimona, it absolutely is a dirty question. It was intended to be a dirty question. It was intended to teach you a lesson so that you learn how to read carefully. I'm gonna move on because y'all just have me dying here. Well said, Tiffany. All right, so in addition to learning the content, right, learning to understand the test, learning how to deal with it, learning to recognize the games that are being played, learning to execute all of these skills in the proper context for the test, hopefully what that does is that helps you build your confidence so that you go into the GMAT with a clear understanding, having proven it to yourself, right? You don't want to go into this test, hoping for a score, right? You're not trying to go into the test hoping you hit what you want. You want to go into the test when you know you're going to get the score you want. Because any practice test you take is going to be fundamentally a range of scores. The GMAT itself is an approximate score, right? If you actually look at the GMAT information, what they tell you is any score is really a score range, which is basically plus or minus 30 points. So if I score on a practice test of 550, what that says to me is on any given day, I'll score between a 520 and a 580. So if I want to get a 550 at the end of the day, I'm not going to go into the GMAT until I'm scoring 600 on a practice test, right? That way I can be reasonably certain that if I have a bad day, right, I will, my score will fall down and my 600 will actually be a 570, which is acceptable to me, right? You don't want to go into the test scoring a 400 hoping you get a 5, because hope doesn't increase scores, right? So you want evidence of your score. You want to have a plan for achieving the score. You want to have achieved this score already in the past before you walk into the test, and that'll give you sort of that best hope of, of getting that score the next time. And then in terms of preparation, you want to make sure you drown out the naysayers. Don't listen to all those people. Like, one, think about how many people you've talked to who said they got a 700. How come none of us, like, think about the volume of people you've talked to who got a 700 versus the volume of people you've talked to who've gotten a 400. Somehow it's a whole lot more 700s. Now, I'm not calling anyone a liar. I'm just saying that the numbers don't bear it out that I would meet mostly 700s in the course of talking about the GMAT, right? So you have to be able to get past the people who aren't going to motivate you, the people who tell you you can't do it, the people who tell you bad statistics, all of that, right? Preparing for the test, you have to build your own confidence. You have to only hang out with people who are going to encourage, motivate you to do well on the test, not the people who are going to tell you how difficult it is, how unlikely it is for you to achieve what you want, right? Because almost everyone can get a good score on the test with enough work, right? And by good score, I mean like high 5.6s. Most people can get a high 5.6s. To get into the 7s, it takes some stuff, right? It takes a little bit more work, effort, knowledge, savvy, whatever you want to call it. But to get to 6, it's generally information. So if you increase your information, if you increase your ability to apply that information, generally people can get to a 6. The question will only remain, how long will it take you to get there, right? And that often is the challenge. Do you have enough time to achieve the result you want, right? And so a lot of that is going to be putting together a good plan for achieving that result, which means getting questions right. Obviously, the best way to get a good score is to get questions right. But you have to front load your accuracy. Because it's an adaptive test, the placement of right and wrong answers impacts your score as much as how many you get right and wrong. Okay? So it's not just about, did you get 12 questions right? Right? If you got the first 12 questions right, and then the other, let's say in quant, you got the first 12 right, and then the last 20 odd questions wrong, you would have a better score than somebody who did the reverse, right? Even though you got the exact same number of questions correct and incorrect, right? So a big part of the test is the placement of your right and wrong answer and sort of learning to manage that. So if you sort of front load accuracy, you concentrate on the earlier portion of the test on being as accurate as possible, and in the later portion of the test on getting through as many questions as possible, right? So it's kind of two different tests you end up taking, or the two different approaches to a section, right? That sort of will give you sort of that best option or that best likelihood of getting a good score. You also have to avoid runs of wrong answers. It's an adaptive test. So getting 3 in a row wrong is generally more harmful to a certain extent than getting 3 wrong that are spread out. So if you're one of those people who obsess about a question, you got something wrong, and you continue to worry about it 4 or 5 questions down the road, right? You've got to break that habit, because all that means is when you're working on question 2, if you're still thinking about question 1, right, you're much more likely to mess up question 2. So you've got to learn to sort of manage that, feeling of, did I get the last question right or wrong, right? Because that's going to just hurt your score. No, the test doesn't give you any information about the right wrongness, right? So as you do a question, the test knows whether you got it right or wrong, and they will give you the next question according to whether you got it right or wrong, but they won't actually tell you any information. At the end of the test, the only thing that happens, you don't find out any information during the test. At the end of the test, what you find out is your score and pretty much nothing else. So it's a very unsatisfactory report at the end of the test because you don't know how you got the score you got, right? Here's a couple of screenshots that I think are really useful for you guys to sort of pay attention to, right? If we look at this person who took the test, right? This is a screenshot from GMAT Prep, right? The official test, the official practice test from GMAC, right? So this person went through the whole section, got 37 quant questions right and 11 wrong, and ended up getting through the whole test, right? The incorrect answers are fairly evenly distributed, all right? At the end of the day, the score, the subsection score for quant, which ranges between 6 and 52 or so, was a 49. So it's a really good score, somewhere in the 90-something percentile, right? So this is the person who got through the whole test. Whereas this person, and this is a different screenshot, right? It's just from a slightly different version of the test, so all the things that aren't marked incorrect are correct, all right? So this person, on the other hand, right, went much more slowly, got the vast majority of the first 26 questions correct, and then at the end of the test, fundamentally looks like he just rushed through it and got a ton of questions wrong. But what's interesting is that this is the exact same score, right? What that should say to you is that if you are the tortoise, right, if you're slow, methodical, but highly accurate, you can still get a great score, right? Versus somebody who's more intuitive and quick, right? So it's a different way of test taking, and what you have to do is figure out what's the most effective way for you to take this test. And if you know the most effective way for you to take the test, then you're better off, right? You want to play to your skills. So Jamie, this person at the end of the test, she guessed on those questions. Everything that's not marked incorrect is actually correct. You can't leave blanks on the test. Well, let me say that better. You can stop answering. So this person could have only, a person could take the GMAT and only complete 30 of 37 quant questions, in which case you'll have the 30 through 37 blank. But you cannot skip question 17 and get to question 18. The test doesn't allow you to skip questions and get the next one, okay? Fundamentally on the test, unless you're scoring very high, it is better to fill in the questions randomly than to leave them blank. We actually have a blog post about guessing versus blanks because GMAC did an analysis of it a few years ago, and we just sort of read that analysis and posted a simpler blog about it. But basically, the short answer is, unless you're in the 90-something percentile, fill in every single answer on the test. All right, great. So as you're going through the test, right, so one, thinking about pacing, thinking about timing, understanding your strategy, right, being able to look at questions like this towards the end of the test, these two questions present a different decision for me than they do at the beginning of the test, right? At the end of the test, where I'm managing the clock, I'm not doing the question on the left, right? Because that question is going to be fairly time-consuming. Whereas the question on the right looks fairly manageable. It's simply a matter of converting things to powers of 3, and I could probably do that relatively quickly. So one of the things you want to understand, and one of the things that a lot of test prep people obsess about in the wrong way or present in the wrong way, is the issue of timing and pacing, right? What you want to understand is that the whole 2 minutes per question that people tend to obsess about is actually presented in the wrong way, right? You should recognize that almost every single question can be done by some GMAT expert in 2 minutes or less in all likelihood. That doesn't mean that it should be done by you in 2 minutes or less, right? What you want to learn to do is be as efficient as possible. And for some things, clearly the question on the right is probably going to require less time than the question on the left unless I know some fancy stuff, right? And for some of us, we can get the question on the left right, that summation question, but it'll take us a lot more time than it would the question on the right. So don't let whatever you're reading, whatever prep you're doing, make you value time over accuracy, especially early on in the test. Because doing a question in 2 minutes isn't worthwhile if you get it wrong, right? So your goal is to maximize your efficiency, not your speed. Those are two very different things. Every question you look at, you want to ask yourself, did I approach it as efficiently as possible? Not did I do it as quickly as possible, right? So don't let us fancy math nerds wow you with how quick we can do it, because if you don't understand how I did it, then that way is not valuable to you, right? It may look nice and fancy, but it doesn't help you if you don't understand it and you don't think you can replicate it next time you see something similar to it, right? So your goal is always to understand approaches that you can replicate on a variety of questions under a timed high-pressure situation. All right. So then thinking about preparing for the test, right? How do I prepare for the test and what do I do? Okay. First and foremost, you got to think about approaching the test differently. What was the answer to the question on the right? The answer to the question on the right is 3 to the, that's 18 again, 3 times, it's E, 3 to the 19. Yes, it is. Good job, Alfred. Wait, y'all actually trying to beat me to the answer? I don't like that, Alfred and Charles. All right, so the answer to the question on the right is E. So thinking about approaching the test differently, right? If you've been one of those people to try to plow through the math, right? Actually, if we jump back to this question, right? I've seen some people actually try to work out the math on 6 to the 27. Well, that's not actually how the GMAT works, right? The GMAT isn't a math test. It's a reasoning test using math, right? So you have to use math to reason through these problems, but you shouldn't be focused on crunching numbers so much. So that's really what you're thinking about. And even if we think about the question on the left here, right? It's not really about using the summation formula, right? The summation formula, which if you don't know it, that's something probably worth learning, but it's actually not the most efficient way to approach the question on the left, because that's not really what the test is about. It's not about crunching numbers. It's about higher order thinking, what they love to call higher order thinking, which means thoughtful application of rules, right? Thoughtful application of understanding, okay? So you have to start approaching the test differently. You have to develop strategies that allow you to use the information and the skills that you possess to do as well as possible and approach the test as efficiently as possible, right? You can't go into the test, and if you're taking the test relatively soon, I don't have a whole lot of advice for you, but the way I understand it, pray on it doesn't work so much, and I hear a lot of people talk, I'm just going to take it, I got a 400, I'm going to pray on it and hope I get a 550 next time. That usually doesn't result in good test scores, right? So you have to actually do something to improve your scores, right? Generally speaking, score fluctuations happen within like 30 points. So if you are not within 30, 40 points of your target score, then you really have to reconsider when you're taking the test. Or you have to reconsider what you need to do in the time you have until your test. Many of you have until the end of January or the end of February to take the test. So you have a significant amount of time if you get started now. So let's not talk about a 5-day plan. Let's talk about sort of creating an effective prep plan that's going to give you the time to put in good effort to increase that score, right? Which means starting to create a plan, right? Getting some help. Think about how many things you've learned tonight, and I'll fundamentally tell you, I've told you nothing tonight, right? In all honesty, this has been a nice, fancy thing to give you some perspective on the test, but I haven't actually taught you very much. We've covered one exponent rule in a variety of ways. We've talked about modifiers in a variety of ways. So 2 of like 250 things on the GMAT, right? In the hour and change we've been here, all right? So you're going to need some real time to build up your skill set to do well on the test. So you have to make sure you give yourself that time. And on the other hand, right, in the hour and a half I've been here, think about how many things you're like, oh, that's really good advice. That's cool, right? That's why I say get help. Because I've been doing this for 20 years. I can kind of efficiently point you to the things that are going to help you and save you a ton of time, right? If you're going to do it on your own, it is possible, and I'm not saying it's not possible to get a good score improvement on your own, but it will generally take more time than having somebody help you. So those are the kind of things you have to think about, right? So you have to put in the time. You have to use computer-based practice. There's no substitute for computer-based practice. This is a computer-based test. You have to practice on computer at one point or another. You have to know things such as the essay score does not factor into your 200 to 800 score at all. All right? The essay and the integrated reasoning are not part of the 200 to 800 number. The only parts of the 200 to 800 number are the quant and verbal subscores. Okay? So those are sort of separate elements. The integrated reasoning is growing in importance at business schools, but still the 200 to 800 number is going to be the primary things that schools are focusing on. Secondary will be your subscores for quant and verbal, right? Tertiary will be your integrated reasoning score probably, and quaternary, which is probably a word I'm making up, will be your essay score. So the essay is the least important component of the entire GMAT score, all right? So here's what like a 3-month prep plan would look like, which is what most of you are probably looking at about now, right? Gives you all of November, all of December, and most of January. All right, some of you have slightly more. All right, first, foremost, research your prep option. Courses, tutors, self-study. Begin any pre-work you can. If there are formulas, rules, terms that you can memorize, no one's going to memorize them for you. You might as well start learning them now. Memorize the first 12 prime numbers. Memorize your times table. The GMAT doesn't give you a calculator. If you haven't done math without a calculator or Excel in 10 years, well, now's the time to start practicing that, right? Because no one's going to be able to help you with that. So do as much of this pre-work as you can while you're figuring out what method you're going to use to prepare for this test. There is no calculator on the GMAT whatsoever. No TI nothing, no on-screen calculator. You are doing math by hand again. So when you are practicing for the test, learn to do the math by hand once again. Right? Lots of fun, because that's just how business school will be. In business school, they will never let you use a calculator. Of course not. I don't know why the test does it. The integrated reasoning portion of the test allows you a calculator. So if you heard rumors of a calculator, it's solely for the integrated reasoning. It is not for the quant section. All right. And then you might end up doing some post-course work, right? You might, after the course, want to go back in and finish the official guide problems, which you haven't done. You might want to sign up for something like GMAT Focus. So there's a lot of different things you can do, bracketed around sort of any kind of preparation you do with a company, but you got to make sure you give yourself time for that and you put together a real plan for that, right? Call your mom and your dad and tell them you can't do weekly dinners anymore, right? You want to call, your boyfriend and your girlfriend, tell them, yeah, we can't hang out 3 nights a week because now the GMAT's my new boyfriend. All right, so make sure you plan around all of this stuff, okay? And you should be planning on probably 2 administrations of the test. The first test that you're taking in either the end of January or end of December for MLT, and I'm assuming that no one has taken the test yet, which I know is not completely true for some of you. But if I was sitting here right now, having not taken the GMAT at all, I would be thinking about 2 tests. The first test I would be thinking about would be the one right before my deadline, right? Either January 24th or February 28th test, or vice versa. And then the second test I'm thinking about is my best score test, right? Let's say you're at a 500 right now, and for January 24th, you have a 600. Well, you should take the test again anyway. Even though a 100-point improvement is great, right? MLT is going to continually push you until you have at least 650. There are a couple of reasons for that. The top 30 schools all average around 650 GMAT. So if you don't get a 650, you're making it that much more difficult, right, to get in. So you're really thinking about your target GMAT score is not the 500 to start MLT, it's the 650, maybe 700 to get into B school, right? So your goal is not MLT's 500, right? That's a sort of that's an interstitial point, right? That's one little blip along the way to your 650 GMAT. And really you should be thinking, I'm going to get me a 700. If you get a 700, you'll make it rain. The consortium will throw some money at you. B schools will all of a sudden start to throw some dollars at you, right? 700 starts to loosen up the pockets. So your goal isn't about the 500 for MLT. That's yeah, whatever, right? The 700 where I can make it rain, right, is really the number that I care about, right? So start planning for those 2 administrations of the test, right? That MLT required test is going to be 1 test along the way, right? So as you're doing all of this, let's say you hit your 500, right, but you don't get a 650, MLT is going to put a date on your next test. So what they typically do is there's that first deadline in the end of January, end of February, whichever it is for you, and then once you start the program, you'll have another deadline, which will typically be mid-June for retaking the GMAT, okay? And if you don't have a 650, part of starting MLT's program will be you signing up for a GMAT prep course, right? MLT is not going to accept that, you have a 500 and you're studying on your own. They want to know that you've signed up for some prep course and that you are actively working on improving your score, not just doing it on your own, which generally tends to be more inefficient. And there's a lot of reasons that they're going to require that, mostly historical sort of evidence. In the first few years I worked with MLT, we had lots of people who hadn't taken the GMAT at all, in December of the year that they were applying. So they can't allow that to happen. So they're going to have some GMAT deadlines, and if you don't hit those GMAT deadlines, you're likely to be kicked out of the program. Okay, so you got to make sure that you stay on top of those and you get your GMAT taken care of as soon as possible. What you will hear over and over from MLT alums is that once they got the GMAT out of the way, the rest of the program was so much better, right? Because then you don't have these dual things pushing at you, essays and GMAT over and over, trying to work on both, okay? So think through that 3-month prep plan, but really it may be more extensive than that, right? You're thinking about courses, tutor, and then the least of the three is sort of that self-study. Courses tend to be that most balanced value of instructional time as well as cost. Tutors offer the greatest instructional value because they tend to be more focused, but they tend to be also the most expensive option. So you're going to have to think about what those options mean. As you start to prepare, you should take advantage of all the resources you have, which may just mean being annoying. I don't like classes where people come in and don't comment. We've got 60 odd, 70 people in the room, and we have 3 people asking questions over and over again. So all the people who are sitting there passively taking in this information aren't doing their best job to get what they need. Right? So you have to make sure if you pay for a course, I don't care how annoying you think it makes you look, you should get your $1,000 worth. So you should ask $1,000 worth of questions, regardless of the dirty looks you get from other people in the room. Right? Let the teacher manage that. So you got to make sure you take advantage of this stuff. Right? And you got to do the time. You have to put in the time and effort. I tell my students that they're probably looking at somewhere in the range of 8 to 10, 8 to 12 hours of homework outside of class per week. You need to be ready to do that. Right? If you're ready to do that, you will probably get the improvement you're looking for. And along the MLT's favorite motto, be scrappy. Right? You just got to keep working at it. Like I said, most people can get in that high 5s, 6s with enough time and effort, right? So you just got to keep at it. If your score's not moving, you may need to take a different approach, right? If you've done a prep course before and it didn't work for you, then look at others, all right? So you just have to keep working at it, and with a little bit of dedication and hard work and good guidance, most people should be able to hit some reasonable, admittable numbers, okay? So that's sort of a wrap up. Let me actually throw this up there, a couple of different options for you. Someone asked about financial aid. MLT doesn't do anything specific around GMAT prep. MLT does not do GMAT prep. Let me just put it that way. MLT connects you with great organizations such as Bell Curves, which will provide you access to GMAT prep providers. But MLT itself doesn't do any GMAT prep. MLT doesn't offer any discounts, although from different organizations like Bell Curves, who loves MLT and has been working with MLT forever, we will give you things like discount codes. So we have a standing MLT discount code, which is the 10%, which will last basically forever. We'll probably re-up some sort of discount code next year. So when that one expires, there'll probably be another one. We have a 15% discount code, which will expire in a week. To make you people get off of your heinies and do something relatively quickly, because you don't have very long. So we have courses that are starting pretty soon. If you want to take advantage of that 15%, you can do that. The other thing that's interesting, being part of a group like MLT, and I think one of the things that's most exciting about the courses that I teach is we often have classes that are a lot of MLTers, right? Which creates a really cool communal vibe of people who are all on the same schedule, working together, going to the same conferences, right? So another option for you, especially those who are in a city together. Like I know that one of Bell Curve's alum was trying to put together a DC class, was trying to get together enough people to run a Bell Curve's class in DC. We don't currently have a DC schedule. But if we have 10 people, we have 6 people in DC who are interested in a class, we'll design a class just for them. All right, so if you're in an area that we can come to, we'd be happy to do that, and we can set up specific stuff like that. If you have 6 friends or whatever, right, send me an email with the names of all the people interested, and we can put that together relatively quickly. So a few different options for kind of creating a prep course that can work for you. All right, and you can find out more information on our website, and obviously sending us emails. My email is akil@bellcurves.com, and I'll answer a few of your questions now while we have a little bit of time left. I know Hanny's gotten to a lot of them, but are there any other questions we can take for you? Zachary wants to know the biggest hurdle in GMAT study. It's different for everybody, but the big problem with GMAT self-study is that you have to be teacher and student. So if you get something wrong, who explains to you why it's wrong, right? If you're trying to determine when to take a practice test, who answers that question for you? So one of the beauties of a prep course or a tutor is you have somebody to work out what material are you going to use? What's the curriculum look like? When do you take practice tests? What homework should you do this week? So you have somebody to take care of all of that, and all you have to worry about is studying. So I find the biggest problem with self-study is that there's so much you have to do on top of studying, which makes it a challenge, right? We currently don't offer classes in Philly, but like I said, Philly's not far from New York. I could send Hanny down on a bus to Philly and he could teach the Philly class. So if we had 6 people in Philly ready to go, we could put together a class in Philly, or we could do an online class. We have online classes as well, which actually we conduct through Adobe Connect. And when we do our online classes, we don't allow 70 people in the room. Instead, we keep it to 5 or 10, and we actually allow two-way audio. And so you'll be able to communicate directly, not just through chat, with the instructor when we do our online classes. So this is similar to the platform we use for the online class, except I've made it more restrictive so that we didn't have as many, so it wasn't as hard, it wasn't as many voices in the room. But in our online classes, we normally keep it to 6 to 10 people, so it's a really small, intimate group, and you can talk to your teachers. So when you're researching prep courses, keep in mind that online doesn't mean the same thing for everybody. Some people say online classes, and what they mean is video recordings. Other people say online classes, and they mean something like this, where it's a live class simply conducted online. Okay, let me see if there are any other questions here. Typical improvements, somebody wants to know. They vary a ton, but I would say our average improvement, I believe the average was around 108 points last time we checked. That's the last number I remember. What you want to think about is, what does that mean to you, and what kind of time do you have? If you're starting at a 600, 108 points isn't necessarily the number that you're going to be looking at, because there's less room to grow there, and it may take more time to get the 100 points from 6 to 7. That's a harder 100 points than the 100 points from 3 to 4. Okay, so those things mean different stuff. Let's see. Official scores must be no older than 2010. Okay. So you have to have official scores for MLT, and notice, I don't know if everyone saw the comments, but those official scores must be fairly recent. While the GMAT keeps your scores on record for 5 years, MLT wants you to have a more recent test than that. They want you to have a score from no later than 2010. Okay? And that's actually probably because some business schools require that you have a score that's only 3 years old. Okay? Let's see what other questions we have. Taking practice this weekend was the longest window between. So your window between practices and real tests is kind of up to you. If you have been studying, so what I generally say is that you want to take the real tests when you have good evidence that your practice tests are reflective of your abilities. So one practice test isn't enough. I had a student recently who took one practice test, got a 550. She went into the GMAT a week later and got a 350. Now, she had only taken one practice test and hadn't done significant practice. She wasn't my student. She was someone who had called me about tutoring. But she'd only taken one practice test. I would never allow my student to go into the GMAT having only taken one practice test. Right? So you have to, as much as possible, take multiple tests so that you have good evidence, right? Multiple data points that tell you this is what I will probably get on the test. Right? That's what you're looking for. Let's see. We may be adding, somebody had mentioned that our next online class doesn't start to December. If you are interested in something, like I said, if you're interested in something and we don't have it, shoot us an email and we'll fix it. We may actually add another online class depending on how much interest we have. Let's see what other questions we have here. For MLT, to submit your application to MLT, you have to have a practice score by December 1st. So I highly recommend that what you should all do if you haven't taken a practice test is go to mba.com, just download GMAT Prep, take that test, and submit that to MLT, because that'll give you the best estimate of your current readiness for the GMAT, right? Because MBA.com are the folks who write the GMAT, so they'll be giving you that best possible results. Because all practice tests are approximate, at least MBA.com is the best of those approximations. Okay. MLT accepts a lot of people round 2, so don't worry about, if you've already missed round 1, which many of you have, don't worry about it. Still submit round 2. MLT is often going to take a lot of people from round 2 as well as from round 1. Okay. For the official test, you want to limit the number of times you take it, partially because it costs $250 each time you take the test, right? You also want to limit the number of times you take the test because you don't need to send a ton of scores to business schools. Every time you take the test, the score will remain on record for 5 years. You would much rather submit one 650 to your business school of choice than a 500, a 520, and a 600 or a 650, right? That's going to look different. They're going to start to question what was going on before, and you don't want to do that. Now, many business schools will only look at the highest score, so don't sweat it if you have a score on record, right? But if you can still control that, then you don't want to start taking a whole heck of a lot of official tests, right? You don't want to take an official test unprepared because those scores are going to go to business schools, right? Imagine how a business school would interpret it if you got a 300 on a test. Even if you got a 650 on the next one, they're still going to see that 300, and it might make them scratch their heads. And you don't want to do anything that might make them scratch their heads and wonder about you as an applicant, okay? Hakeem, you were asking about taking tests from other companies. If you've already taken a test from another company, I would say yes, MLT will accept it, submit it. If you haven't taken a practice test, then use the MBA.com practice test. Other companies' practice tests aren't as reliable as the MBA.com. And when I say other company, I'm including bell curves in that, right? All of us are trying to approximate the actual GMAT. Well, the only people who obviously are going to get it right are the people who wrote the test. And so if you still have time for that, take those official practice tests. We have all of our students in our classes start with the official MBA.com test and take those tests as well as taking ours. And now GMAC has actually released 2 extra ones. So we have 4 official tests to use, which is a way better deal than trying to use our tests, which no matter, again, how much time and energy we put into making them good, they can never be as good as the real ones. Okay. Yeah, Devin, GMAC, if you have GMAT Prep, the newest release, they will allow you to purchase 2 more pools of questions for 2 new tests. So there's a total of 4 tests available. And if you just go through MBA.com, you can find that out. What would be your tips in preparing for a practice test? At this point, it's a practice test. Don't sweat it so much. Like, take the test. You might want to review some of the stuff in the official guide if you have it, but it's a practice test. The scores are going to go nowhere except to you, MLT, and maybe us if you sign up for one of our classes, right? But that's not, it's not the end of the world if that practice test isn't going to be your best score. It's absolutely not going to be your best score because you're going to prepare, you're going to get better, so don't worry about preparing for a practice test, right? You just need a benchmark number to work with today. Okay. All right. What other questions do we have? All right. So Jeanette's handling some of the MLT questions. Let me see if there are any other questions about the GMAT that I can handle for you today. Okay. Anything else? Any other questions before we wrap it up? I'll stay as long as folks have questions. Do you know of anyone not strong? I know lots of people who aren't strong in math who've done completely fine with tests. The GMAT test high school math fundamentally. There's no math here that's more complicated than 11th grade math, right? And there's really no 11th grade math on here. There's no trig, there's no calculus, right? There's no college level math. It's all like 7th through 10th grade math applied in a kind of funky way. So it's really a matter of remembering old stuff but learning to apply it in a new way. And the more you're able to do that, the easier this test becomes. Let's see. And Shannon, that's a great point, right? The part of the test is it's a reasoning test. You still have to do some math, but it's fundamentally a reasoning test using math. It's not really a math test. It's a reasoning test using verbal, using your reading comprehension skills. It's not a straightforward math test like you had math tests in school. And that's often the trouble people have with the test because it's not what we normally think of when we equate math and testing. Okay. So Jeffrey from Malawi, awesome. So the best strategy for data sufficiency, I would say that there's a ton of strategies for sort of everything, and there are no miracle, Tinkerbell pixie dust answers. So preparing for the test takes a lot of time, takes a fair bit of effort. It takes some understanding of the types of things the test is looking for. What you want to make sure you're doing is that you're increasing your understanding of the types of things the test is looking for. So for data sufficiency, fundamentally what data sufficiency does is it hides information from you. So the sort of key strategy there is learning to interpret information beyond the obvious that they give you, right? Now, that can play out in 100 different ways, but that's fundamentally what data sufficiency comes down to. It comes down to interpreting information in a sophisticated way, okay? Other questions? What's the difference between the classic and express course? So for our courses specifically, we have two different models. We have a longer class, which is our classic course, which does more sort of comprehensive teaching. We start with sort of, we put everything in that class, right? We'll review how to add fractions. Whereas an express course, we put a little bit more of the work on you. We'll have reading assignments. We'll have more reading assignments where you have to, review adding fractions on your own and come to class with a understanding of how to add fractions, and then we'll show you fancy GMAT things to do with adding fractions. Whereas in the classic course, we do both of those things in class. So the difference between the two classes is the expectation of the work you do outside of class. Okay? And as a general rule, the more you bring to the table, right, the more you'll get out of any program or class you do. Because if you've already reviewed how to add fractions, then I can show you more sophisticated things to do with adding fractions. If I have to teach you adding fractions first, right, then it's going to take me a little bit more time to get to the more sophisticated stuff, which is why our classic course, which sort of covers everything from soups to nuts, is like 50% longer than our express course. All right, other questions? The math skills course, Tammy, absolutely helps with GMAT prep. It's basically, let's take all the math basics out of the GMAT prep class and teach them on their own, right? So that you learn the math behind the GMAT prep. But given the timeline you have, I don't think you really have time for that, Tammy. Because if you're applying to MLT for, their February test, you don't have time to do it right, which would be doing the math skills first and then doing a GMAT prep class. You don't really have time for that. So what you probably want to do is sort of, is kind of just jump right into probably the classic course at this point, because you still have time for that. Hopefully. I haven't looked at the schedules, but with the holidays, it's a little bit tight for the January deadline. It should be fine for the February test. Okay. What is a trick you have used, acronym or catchphrase, to remember a specific approach? Ooh, I don't know. I don't do a whole lot of acronyms. I like RTFQ, but that's not really specific. It stands for read the full question. Yeah, I hear you, Tammy. The problem with most of those things is that they're so narrow, they're not great for the GMAT, right? The GMAT tends to be more broad than that, and those acronyms tend to be about one particular thing. PEMDAS is a good example of that, because the GMAT, PEMDAS would never be tested by itself on the GMAT. So memorizing PEMDAS will start you, it just will never actually finish a problem. So I'm sure there are some. I'm blanking on one particular thing I could give you right now, Tammy. All right, so other questions. Let's see, any other questions? We'll hang out as long as you have questions. If not, we'll wrap it up. You never share your background with us. My personal background? Um, my background is I started doing test prep in 1990 when I was a freshman in college. I started with SAT prep, and I've been doing test prep ever since. I worked at the Princeton Review for a whole bunch of years, and then I started my own company. That's the short story. And for the last 10 years, I've been running bell curves um, and working with organizations like MLT. All right. Let's see. Um, Emmanuel, we're probably going to add a couple of schedules. So we'll look at the schedules and see what kind of interest we have, but we may add an express schedule to meet those MLT deadlines. I just found out about the MLT deadlines today because I didn't know what time they were going to be this year. So we'll look at our schedules and we'll try to make sure we have something that allows you guys to take the tests prior to your MLT deadlines. The other thing to consider is you don't have to finish your course before you take your first test. Because remember, your goal isn't the 500. Your goal is that 700, right? So you could take a classic course that starts in January and runs through April, let's say. You'll take a official test before the course is done, right? Hopefully, somewhere after the halfway point, right? And then take another one, when the course is done a couple of weeks later. So remember, your goal is the official test that you care about, the official score you care about is the one that you want to use for admissions. And we don't care about a 500 because that's not getting you into a top 30 school, right? What you care about is that 650, 700. So you just may roll through that first MLT test as a practice test, right? And then take your real test in March or April or May, whatever it is, when you're ready to get your 650, 700. Okay. Other questions? All right, great. Well, if you have additional questions, you can reach me or Hanny, right? It's just our first name at bellcurves.com. And we'll be happy to answer any additional questions. We're going to make the recording available to most people fairly soon. We'll probably post it on the MLT site. If you have questions about MLT, Janet's posted her, and I keep calling her Janet or Jeanette because I don't know which way it is, but she's posted her email address and more information about MLT on the site for you. Like Janet Jackson, Miss Chin if you're nasty. So great, you have contact information for all of us. If you have questions, feel free to follow up, and we'll do the best to help you. You guys have a good night.